Hey everybody, it's Pastor Joseph. It is Thursday, February 4th. You're probably seeing this in next week's email, or if you're just on the YouTube page, maybe you came across this. I just wanted to talk a little bit sort of informally about Ash Wednesday and Lent and what we're going to be doing, what you can expect and what you have to look forward to. So for Ash Wednesday, we're going to have 2 services. These will be on our usual Zoom and YouTube platforms. So whatever you've been doing, just keep on doing that. We'll have a service at 12:15, which is a spoken service. It's just prayers, gospel reading, invitation to Lent. It's about 15 minutes or so. It's very brief. Our evening service is going to be a more robust sort of full service, and that's going to have homily, songs, readings. It'll also have a communion setting, which I'll talk about in just a second. And we are going to have ashes this year. We're not going to impose them on people because it's sort of difficult to do that given the circumstances. But the next time you're walking by or biking by or driving by the church, the Memorial Garden drop box has ashes in them, or in it. These are just little communion cups filled with ashes. One of these should work for a household. Ashes go farther than you would think. So just grab one of these, and then you can use that during the service for your ashes. For Lent, we're going to go back to doing communion during church. It's been about a year since we had communion during a church service. I think March 8th was the last time we did. Whether you should do virtual communion, this is just some background that might be helpful. In the ELCA, decisions about things like virtual communion are left up to individual congregations to decide. So, for example, if you did the post-Christmas service with Pastor Julie Peterson from Ascension in Newtown, she does a communion setting every week as part of their service. If you go to St. John's Summit, they do a thing that's pre-recorded and there's no communion as part of that. And those are both perfectly sort of acceptable ways to do things within the ELCA. We're going to go back to doing a communion setting. It's going to be brief, and I'll explain part of that in a second. But I think it's important for us to be thinking about sort of the ways that virtual communion sort of doesn't work, or what you sort of miss when you do that, and what isn't being communicated during virtual communion that you would want sort of people to be aware of. So my plan is to spend those sort of the month and a few days, week leading up to Holy Week, doing homilies every Sunday about communion and sort of what does communion mean? What does it mean to live a Eucharistically shaped life? And what do we want to be thinking about when we do communion in this sort of unusual way? 2 just very brief examples of that I think it's important to be aware of. Here at Advent, since I've been here, we've practiced open table communion, which means everyone who comes to the table gets communion. It doesn't matter how old you are, it doesn't matter what your background is, it doesn't matter, if you want communion, you're welcome at the table. And typically on a Sunday after that, we would send out from the assembly to people who aren't able to be in church. So I would usually drive around or bike around, and I'd visit our homebound members who can't get out, and I'd bring communion to them. Everyone who has communion wants communion, essentially. What's different about virtual communion is that isn't true anymore. And so we have people, for example, who are homebound and are not doing regular in-person visits because of COVID right now. And they don't have devices that they can access our services with. So they're not able to participate in communion. And I think most of them understand sort of the circumstances and why that's true. But it says something important about sort of what our communion service means and the way it's done, that everyone is welcome. And if everyone isn't welcome, then we have to think about what that means for our current practices. I know I talked last summer about how St. Matthew Trinity Lunchtime Ministry wasn't doing indoor services of meals because of COVID and the regulations and the virus and everything. And sort of what does it mean to be fed at Jesus's table here, but to not be able to have that there, right? So these are sort of the ethical, theological issues that you want to be thinking about when we come to the table. What are the other tables that we're also being fed at, and who are the people who can't come to the table under the circumstances? Another sort of thing just to be thinking about is, where is the body of Christ in the sacrament? The sort of clear answer, I think, if you did your confirmation catechism stuff, is that the body of Christ is present in the elements and in the Word with the elements that creates faith in us. The other place the body of Christ is present in the sacrament is in the assembly itself. And so when we receive communion, it isn't just like a container for Jesus, right? But we actually become the body of Christ when we stand in the place where Jesus is and speak his words to the one he calls the Father. So the Eucharistic theology that we have as Lutherans assumes there's a public assembly, a public gathering of people who become the body of Christ within this moment in time. And with virtual communion, that becomes sort of difficult in ways that seem esoteric, but are sort of very important for us theologically. The last thing is longer than I thought it would be, but the last thing I want to let you know is it'll be a little bit different when we're actually doing communion. So you can set up your own bread and wine or juice and candle, or whatever your sort of setup is at home. But what's going to be different is the Eucharistic prayer and setting we're using. During a typical Sunday Mass setting, we bring the gifts up to the altar, and then Jason and I have a sort of back and forth. There's dialogue with the congregation. There's the Sanctus. There's the preface. There's the Agnus Dei, right? So we have this constant bouncing back and forth among various voices, which is obviously very important. But on Zoom, it's a little bit difficult to do some of the bouncing back with the muting and unmuting. So as it just so happens, we're going to use Eucharistic Prayer 11. You probably can't see this. It's probably a little too bright. But Eucharistic Prayer 11 was written in the 3rd century by, his name was Hippolytus. I'm probably saying that wrong. He's called Hippolytus of Rome. People seem unclear where he actually lived. It's above my pay grade. But this is one of the oldest Eucharistic prayers that we have in existence. And it's so old that the other stuff we do during a communion setting, like the Sanctus, like the preface, is that actually came later. And so this Eucharistic prayer is actually designed to be used, it's designed to be used with no preface, with no Sanctus, sort of just as is. Which means it's the oldest prayer in the book, but it actually ends up working well for sort of our Zoom lifestyle that we're engaged in right now. It's a really beautiful prayer. It's similar to the Eucharistic prayer number 2 if you've been to a Catholic church recently. I think that's the shortest prayer that they use during a Mass setting. Anyway, so this will be a little different, but it should look familiar and it should be good. So I'll see you this weekend. I will see you during Bible study. Anyway, and I'll see you on Ash Wednesday and Lent. It should be good. Take care.